That's what I didn't do last time.
Okay, now,
Recording. Good
now,
afternoon. Welcome to Talking Smart Conversations with colleagues and educators, colleagues in education and philosophy from around the world. I'm Richard Mort, Morehouse. Today's guest is Professor David Kennedy. David is a recently retired faculty member from the Montclair State University. He has been teaching philosophy of childhood, philosophy, educational theories, and philosophy of schooling. He did his doctorate at the University of Kentucky, where his thesis was on young children's thinking and interpretation from phenomenology. He did his master's degree at Eastern Montana University in early childhood in 1978, part of which was a teacher corps fellow. He was a teacher corps fellow, and he did a Bachelor's of Arts at Decorah College in Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and a part of which he did his undergraduate experience was also in literature and anthropology at Columbia University in New York. And the rest of the biography we can read online when the interview is published. So if you don't mind that short introduction, we can get started. So, and we kind of talked about looking at the dialogical self. And it was very interesting because there's a great, maybe I put that, no, it was right there. But anyway, I have a notebook here with all this stuff in, but this might be a really interesting place to just start talking about the dialogical self and its relationship to philosophy for children and other things. And as we were talking earlier, this is from, I think, one of the first articles that Herman published with Kelp and van Loon, both from University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And anyway, the second paragraph partially reads, "This view, dialogical self, is based on the notion that people have told each other stories and listened to stories in all cultures at all times. In doing so, people arrived at an understanding and an ordering of the world and the self. We will show that the self, conceived as a dialogical narrator, is partially organized and embodied, and social with others and outside, not outside, but with the other, I should say, not outside, but inside the self-structure, resulting in a multiplicity of dialogical interacting selves." And I thought that was a really nice kind of summary and a great introduction for me to the whole theory. And I think that short paragraph, partial paragraph actually, kind of sets up, I think, part of what we want to talk about in terms of teaching, storytelling, philosophy and storytelling, and how all of that is interrelated with a self that is both embodied and social. So any comments on any of that as we start to talk about this?
Well, actually, it sort of represents two areas of preoccupation for me. One being educational and particularly CPI, Community of Philosophical Inquiry, as based on dialogue. And then thinking about scolae, or a new old new form of schooling, which had its first sort of phantom appearance in ancient Athens, the idea of a dialogical school as a school that's based on dialogue. And that in turn, or implies also dialogue between adults and children, teachers and students, one generation and another. And so my preoccupation has been how can we give some basic guidelines or outlines of a dialogical school? What would it look like? What there would be questions of authority, between adults and children, or teachers and students. Questions of agency, like how much power students have in terms of the schools, running the school and constituting the school. And then the issue of curriculum, like how curriculum can be rendered dialogical. So on the other side, the other preoccupation with DST has been a very personal one, in the sense of trying to hear whatever voices are speaking inside of me, which is not, as I think I said the last time we met, is not so easy to prize them apart, to identify actually the voices that I can say, yeah, I recognize that voice, or I recognize that voice. So in a sense, it's been a very personal, like as a like most everybody else, as a recovering, I call myself a recovering Cartesian,
Yes, yes.
So, how does this theory actually, where does the rubber meet the road? And that's what I'm kind of preoccupied with right now. So I'm writing a paper for this conference in which I'm sort of trying to compare DST with the two models that I'm most familiar with, and which I think are sort of proto-DST, Jung and Freud, both of them.
Oh, yes, yes.
But I find that the lots of elements in Jungian psychology, and I'm a hopeless Jungian, that lots of elements don't seem to be present or don't seem to be mentioned. For example, the notion of the ego, as given both by Freud and Jung, where do we find that articulate? Is it an I position? Is it a meta position? Is it an internal promoter position? What about the ego? So right now I'm sort of engaged in a sort of a written meditation on the relationship between DST, the fundamentals of DST and the fundamentals of Jungian psychology. And of course, the other thing which is referred to in a sort of superficial way throughout, but never actually encountered in DST, is the relationship between conscious and unconscious contents of the personality, and where the ego, I sort of see the ego as sort of as in this liminal zone between conscious and unconscious content. So it's both looking backwards and looking forwards. It's never really mentioned except, I mean, Herman sometimes talks about shadow positions. But the shadow is a huge thing in Jung, right? It's the whole process of healing, so to speak, begins with recognizing and acknowledging our own shadow. And that's not really present in DST. So in spite of my love for the theory, it's very sexy. I'm sort of struggling to personalize it, so to speak, to understand myself as a post-Cartesian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, this may not be an obvious connection right away, except that I just read an article about Jung and architecture.
Mm.
And the person that wrote the article, I don't remember his name, but I can send it to you if you'd like. I know I still have it someplace. Very interesting look at the and in some ways, he doesn't really deal, you're right, he doesn't, even in that article, he doesn't hardly deal with ego. What he deals with is levels of consciousness, so that you go from fully conscious to all the levels of subconsciousness, and he traces Jungian personality, I suppose, through several of the structures that Jung designed and built. And, you know, he had at least two major building projects that were in one with several sub-basements and all kinds of interesting little ideas like that. So just a
Wow.
very, very interesting piece. And it was nice because for my mind, it made it all very visual. It's nice to see ideas in some kind of visual construction for me at times.
Mhm.
So anyway, that's probably a topic for another conversation, but I just think that well, Jung is quite fascinating. I myself just dash back and forth sometimes between wanting to be dismissive of Jung and want to be fully engaged with his thinking, because the best of his, well, I think it's not Jung that I run from, but people who, as Jung writes in one of his essays, who people who ape ideas. And there are a lot of people who just kind of take Jung's ideas and they spew them out, and they're not understanding anything. They're just spewing it out, and those people and they tend to use Jung as a tool for self-promotion. Anyway, that's a whole nother story, but uh, taking us away from what we want to be talking about is how these ideas of Herman's and Jung and Freud and others fit into your ideas of school and dialogical conversation. And I guess my sense is that, again, you know, you take a classic like interpretation of dreams, and one of the beautiful things, at least from my mind, is what you see is Freud in conversation with himself, and the way he uses patient conversation to articulate his own thinking and understanding. Because a part of what, at least my sense of reading interpretation of the dreams, is he's a sensitive listener who is also deeply has a deep understanding of the role of language. And so the person will say a word and he'll focus on the word and he'll look at the genealogy of the word and the architecture of the word and use that as feedback for the person to engage further in their own self-understanding.
What would be an example of such a word?
Pardon?
What would be an example of such a word?
Oh gosh, it's, if I had a better memory, I could tell you that. But you know,
But
I probably only read Interpretation of Dreams probably twice carefully, but so
not you don't mean scientific words, you like repression
oh,
or
no.
experts. No.
A word that a client says, and I seem, oh, because oh gosh, I almost had a word. It just takes a simple word that a person says, and then kind of provides reflection back to the person about that word that person spoke, and kind of, you know, uses that as uses his understanding of language to help them understand what they were saying.
Mhm.
And not using the Freudian language of repression or whatever. Yeah. So
Just like mother or sunshine or
exactly.
emerging at a certain moment in the conversation. Yeah.
And it's good you said that, because I was thinking that mother was one of those words that comes up in one part of the interpretation of dreams. And
Mhm.
I've always said, and I think other people, myself, but when I talk personality, I say Freud had two clients, one Viennese women and the other Sigmund Freud. And because he did his journal every night or every morning, and then he would review it later in the day. So he
Mhm.
had this ongoing conversation with himself about what he was thinking and dreaming, and
Wow.
uh,
That's impressive.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
He knew he was going to be a world figure, must have been.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, that's all. It's so funny because looking at great people, it's for me just reassuring that so many of them didn't have straight paths for their careers.
Right.
Because Freud was a zoologist. He probably thought he would be famous for understanding the sexuality I'm gonna like eels. Yeah, eels. Yeah, that's the right word. The funny snake-like fish. What is it?
Eels.
Eel, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he apparently they are very difficult to determine gender, and he
Mhm.
figured out how to do that.
That's like very symbolic of the later
Yes,
theory.
yes, isn't it? Isn't it? So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
anyway, but
But he was very competitive too, right? Like
oh,
he and Jung really sparks flew. He felt that Jung was threatening his primacy
oh yes,
as the explicator. In fact, he even had a fainting fit in the presence of Jung. I read
yes,
some
yes.
when they're yeah.
He fainted twice, and I can't remember what the other one was. But there are two documented cases where he floated, and one of them, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, most of my energy is sort of trying to focus on what would a school that sort of lived up to the promise of the ideals of progressive education, says, starting in the early 19th century with Romanticism and the influence of Rousseau and people like Mary Shelley
Yes,
and anarchist thought about education throughout the 19th century, early 20th century. Um, how can that, given we're at some sort of terminal low point in terms of the way neo-capitalism or neoliberalism understands school, or although maybe it's always been like that, maybe in ancient Sumer, the people who were the education was in the form of preparing clerks to be able to write. It was all indoctrination. So is there some way to think school beyond indoctrinatory and sort of economic preparation and so on, and a consequent sort of epistemology, mechanistic epistemology, and so on, about
yeah,
the nature of knowledge.
yeah.
So
And
that's
go
been
ahead.
my preoccupation.
Well, yeah, and I know those are ideas that have always been, well, for a long time, I should say, have been floating in my head too. And I always think of, and it's related to the concept, for me at least, of in-group and out-group, in that, a part of, well, individuality develops out of unity, first with the mother, and then through the mother with um, a growing cultural awareness. And as we become more culturally aware, I think we also, of necessity, also become more autonomous. And so, and how those things work together and against each other is a part of this ongoing understanding of dialogue and education that I think a large community of us have been working on in some way or another.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And if I just may make an aside, but I think this is, I should probably do some more reflecting on this, but I think the way that you're looking at the stuff with Herman's and Jung and Freud and philosophy for children and philosophical inquiry is a real sign of the growth of philosophy for children. As I've looked back over the years since 1980, when I was first introduced in that all of that stuff, I have just seen this growth of of several strands of depth that are quintessential philosophy of children, but that have taken it deeper and broader than its beginnings. And I just picked up again a copy of Jen Glazer's dissertation on critical thinking. And
Mhm.
and there are hundreds of people like that who are so embedded in philosophy for children, but who have brought this richness into the dialogue that I think is, I guess I don't think that depth and breadth of understanding about philosophy of children is not as widely appreciated, let's say, within the philosophy of children community as it ought to be. Because I think it's richer than most people think it is. If you're just looking at the surface of philosophy of children, it looks like, well, it looks relatively shallow, even though Matt's work was not shallow at all. But
Mhm.
anyway, I'm carrying on too much here.
Well, I'm interested in thinking about, and I think I have been from the beginning of starting to think about these things, which I'm a late bloomer, so it was late. Um, is this connection between philosophy for children or philosophy with children and philosophy of childhood,
Yes,
sort of
yeah.
seeing the child in a different way, which sort of moves us into childhood studies and history of childhood and sociology to a great extent, which I haven't really been a part of that movement. Um, the critique of developmentalism by Erica Berman, for example, and that whole, but that has now in the last 5, 10 years has translated or morphed into what its proponents are calling childism.
Oh, yes, yes.
Are you familiar with some of
Vaguely,
this rhetoric in
a
there?
greater explanation would be helpful.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm the person to try to explain childism, but the fundamental image or metaphor is that the sort of standard adult-child relationship has been one of colonialism, and in a post or decolonial age, then we again question how children are an oppressed minority. You know, they're the natives in the colonies, the ones the wild being that cannot be that has to be tamed with a whip
Mm.
and so if childism then means a vast new respect for the phenomenon of childhood, and therefore, obviously, by implication, a necessity to change the way we raise children. But then thinking of the school as a place where adult-child dialogue can take place, which dialogue between the generations, in which if it's actual dialogue, then it's mutually agentic, right? It's not a relationship of domination. How can that be constructed and can then the school become a place where the childist vision finds ways of being expressed and developed, you know. And like I say, I think in this paper even that there are all kinds of places that this is being done, right? The Democratic Summerhill as a sort of first exemplar, in the 1921 or whatever, and in some anarchist educational stories. So thinking of the school as a place where um, a new way of looking at childhood is exemplified. And philosophy for children, as which I actually don't like to use that term as much as community of philosophical inquiry because it sort of takes it away from. I mean, philosophy for children almost re-evokes the colonialist metaphor. That's why we say philosophy with. But even that is sort of like philosophy with giraffes, or philosophy, right? you know. So I think CPI, community philosophical inquiry, as a fundamental sort of discourse, like a broad general discourse within the school. So it's not just talking philosophy, it's also talking math by identifying some philosophical elements of it. So it moves towards an interdisciplinary and pan-disciplinary identity. And that is, I think, the great revelation of Lippmann, that he and Sharp, that I think they had this sort of stirring deep in their psyche, when it was an emancipatory movement in a sense.
Yes, yes.
Of course, that's just like the word of one true believer, I mean, it could probably be contested, but so then, but that sort of goes along with the whole political thing, which I haven't really addressed in my writing. But at this moment in history, in the history of global civilization, I mean, clearly there has been, in spite of the horrors we're dealing with today, there has been general sort of progress in terms of constructing and reconstructing social and economic forms that are still woefully inadequate, but we've felt, at least my generation, we've felt optimism. Um, that it was like bit by bit, or step by step, or like climbing a rock face. Get the and the whole idea um, of gene culture coevolution, uh, the idea that evolution is also a cultural phenomenon with what Tomasello calls when something is introduced in the culture by an individual, and I think this depends to a great extent on the great man or woman syndrome, like the sort of prophetic figure. Bergson talks about this too, and so does I think even um, even Deleuze talks about and Jung also about, I don't want to say the great man, but the idea of some form of somebody carrying a new form of intelligence. And if that gets appropriated by the culture, then Tomasello says it's sort of ratcheted into the culture. It becomes a characteristic of all of us, and even to the point where our brains are different on the theory of neoteny, the idea of the long human childhood, that over that period of natality, which is like 22 years or whatever, there's the possibility for new connections, neural connections that are connected with behavior. Like I have this ongoing war with squirrels in my backyard. and I I'm ashamed of it, but I really despise them. I see them as sort of almost reptiles, like totally the reptilian brain, But I noticed that, like when I grease the pole to the bird feeder, or spray with some kind of anti-squirrel bad smell for squirrels, there's always one squirrel that figures out how to climb the bird feeder. There's one squirrel, right? That it's fascinating, right? So this great variety within each species of levels of intelligence or capacity for adaptation to the environment. There's always one, or who's offering a new. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. But I'm sorry that I came to squirrels, because it's hard.
That's all right. It's anybody who has a bird feeder in their front or backyard, and we do. We have one in our front yard, and the squirrels are always a part of that.
Yeah,
We've just we've given up, and we've just learned to love them because they are so imaginative.
they're amazing. They're
And,
amazing.
and the
But
way
they don't care. They don't care about you and me, Mort, and they cannot be made to care. I mean, so this is another issue of the human nature issue, like, is conflict and genocide inevitable
I
because
think
people
so.
have different interests?
What made me change my mind about, well, early on, uh, when I was in my young early 20s, I read a wonderful article in a magazine that was put out by yeah, God, now my mind is gone. But anyway, he had some kind of a Democratic magazine, but this teacher wrote an interesting article. She was taught English in a university someplace, and the title was called "My Pedestrian Students and Those High-Flying Squirrels." And so she was just comparing the energy and inquisitiveness of squirrels with her students not finding anything that she was talking about interesting at all. So
Yeah, but I mean, but they lack an ethical sense, right?
that may
And
well be.
it's a basic sort of ethics, even sort of physical sensibility, like an instinctual ethics, which we're attempting to reach in this planetary synthesis, right? So, I mean, it's not just the squirrels. It's a lot of people too, but we
Yeah.
won't get to that. But even the extent to which maybe this genius squirrel who stands out from the rest is a real son of a bitch, and he's not ethical at all. And if he gets into power, he's gonna tear everything to pieces. So it's a real dilemma for me, because okay, here we are in my yard, and I'll put food out for you, and I'll make this available, and you leave that alone, and just the way you deal with a neighbor. They won't have they're they have no sense of it whatsoever. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, this in a way is sort of a microcosm of how I feel about the world right now.
Yeah.
The world is being torn apart by squirrels.
Well, which kind of brings me back to an earlier point we were talking about, though, and I think I don't know if this fits with the squirrels or not, but um, you know, I learned about Dewey's participatory democracy, and when we left from La Crosse and then Madison to go we were actually heading for the second Selma to Montgomery March.
Mm,
And there were three buses that left from Madison.
mm,
But the SNCC people Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were saying there are too many people in Selma. We don't want to cause a riot. And the King people, the Southern Christian Leadership people were saying, no, we want as many people as we could get. So it keep coming. And so we voted on the bus. On the 3 buses, we all voted. And I think it ended up to having 2 buses going to Washington, D.C. to sit in front of the White House for marshal support and I can't, a particular bill that was before Congress. And the other bus went to Selma, Alabama. And so we went, our bus went to Washington, D.C. But all along through the whole thing, we practiced democracy. There was no leader on the bus. We just got information back from SNCC and from SLIC, and we decided what we wanted to do. And that was just a really valuable lesson for me to begin to understand democracy on a very basic level and what it meant to be a participant and what your voice meant and all of those kinds of things. Yeah. And again, I think that all relates back to the classroom.
Yeah.
And that leaderless, the emerging leaders within a leaderless group is a whole interesting and I think core of your idea of school, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great connection that you made there.
Yeah. Well, that was that's a very memorable event, and so I don't want to make this about me, but it was an interesting thing, and it's the little things. We thought we were going to Selma, and so we left all of our Wisconsin clothes. I mean, we took off our jackets and coats, anything we had, because we were going to Selma, Alabama, and we ended up in Washington, D.C., where it was snowing and raining, and and I think, well, I remember this discussion we had in the church where we slept in pews, and so we were deciding what should happen, and the conversation turned around. Well, if we were willingness to be cattle prodded in Selma, shouldn't we be willing to catch a cold in Washington, D.C.? But that was kind of the nub of the thing, because, I want to be a hero or I want to do something, And so we had to decide if we wanted to do something that was not romantic at all, because standing in the cold in front of the White House didn't impress anybody.
In your shirt sleeves. Wow.
My shirt sleeves, right? Exactly. Yeah. So, and it's the smallness of participatory democracy and those small steps, I think, that we, as a group, have been working on a long time. And I think the valuing of small steps is extremely important.
Yeah, and reconstruction of the school as a small, the importance of scale. So in a sense, this is sort of returning to a pre-industrial school age. The vision is that the schools are in neighborhoods. Paul Goodman wrote this, and what is Denison, The Lives of Children, both of them in the 60s in New York. Small neighborhood schools would seem to be sort of fundamental, which is an anarchist vision, right? There's no arcade, there's no sort of boss over it all. They're just small units interacting and collaborating and networking with each other. And also, I mean, the risk here is to sort of idealize children. because I think that there's a lot of in the process of growing up and in the process of socialization and individuation, that there's a lot of conflict.
Oh, yes.
Um, it's and so it, and I saw this movie which I'm not recalling the name of, um, which was a documentary made by a guy who actually lives around here, of an attempt to found a small school like with 12 kids in a basement, and how one child was a sort of Svengali and kind of subverted everything, right, and turned people against each other, and eventually they had to expel him, which was completely out of their expectation that the one nobody would ever be expelled. So I'll send you the name of it when I remember it. But the idea of risk and the idea of the capacity for dealing with conflict, disciplinary issues, and so on, and attitudinal issues is not something that's really been. I mean, I suppose you could do a study of it by looking back at small schools like this from historical perspective. Usually, though, they're the success stories and not the stories about sort of. Well, Dewey talks about the relationship between impulse and habit, and if we think of school as a place where habit is kind of reconstructed, and but impulse is not denied, is not suppressed. If impulse becomes a sort of trigger for reconstruction and transformation, um, that needs to be, maybe childism is sort of stepping into that place, where it's sort of, and with things like, I mean, the one major attribute of these democratic schools that are popping up all over the world, Sudbury Valley here, and they have an annual conference. They have schools in Israel, schools in Latin America, all over the states, probably 60 in the states. One major, no matter what the differences are in terms of student agency, in terms of choosing what to study, the one major element of these schools is the weekly meeting, like the meeting,
Yes, yes, yes.
like in the bus to Selma, right? It's where everybody makes decisions together. So that's a schooling in direct democracy.
Well, it's so interesting because a lot of those things, uh, you know, I, early in my career, that was part of what I did. Started, well, and I want to say one thing first. One of the things that I think gets neglected or hardly talked about at all in this is Kohlberg's work in the Just Community School. I think hardly anybody reads any of Kohlberg on the Just Community School. Um, and it was, it was a school within a school where people basically did their meetings and decided things in a group. And again, I'm too much on me, but we started a summer program um, through CETA money when it was easy to get money in the Nixon administration, strangely enough. Uh, so as a part of, we worked with students who were economically at risk, and the only criteria was they had to basically be on the poverty list in terms of being in school. We didn't know what grade they were, I mean, how their grades were or anything else about them, except we knew that they were poor because they were in the program. And we did three things that were in all of what we did. We did a joint meeting where they decided about what was going to happen to any of the misbehaviors and whatnot, because we slept overnight with the students in a dorm, and so there's a lot of opportunity for misbehavior. Um, and then we did groups, I suppose sort of therapy groups, but they were just in 1960s groups, where people
E
dealt
groups.
with their issues. And then everybody had to do a project that could be shared by the larger community, either the larger lacrosse community or the larger community of students and staff that were working in the program. And so, and it was just absolutely exciting. And I was only involved in it for the first 3 years of it, and I wrote the program initially, but I think it lasted for about 15 years. Just for a little short summer program ideas. But anyway,
So were
that was,
were you in already teaching at Viterbo at this point?
no,
Or?
I was a grant writer for one of the, well, what do you call them in New York? They called, I don't know. Our thing was called CISA.
Yeah.
And New York has something like, they're called CISAs. They're cooperative entities that work between school districts.
Mhm.
We had like, I don't know, 17 school districts in our CISA. So,
And
and so
this was
wrote
modeled,
grants and then sometimes implemented those programs.
and this was modeled on the Just Community Schools.
Just Community School, Paul Goodman, Community of Scholars, and compulsory miseducation. Uh, Whoever was doing stuff in values clarification and a little bit of Kohlberg thrown in. And so,
So
uh,
where is that all gone?
well,
And
I
can it
think,
come back dialectically?
yeah, well, I, unfortunately, I, I started well, yes, I don't want, the long story is I wrote a school within a school program that was to the state of Wisconsin that was funded under special educational needs. And before we got any money to start the program, they said, no, we didn't mean special education needs like just appropriate educational needs. We meant students with special needs in terms of disabilities, et cetera. So they dumped the program. And so as a long version of the story, and maybe my boss came in and said, I think there's have some money in this CETA program, Community Education Development Grant. And he said, but this is 8 o'clock in the morning. I need to take it to the meeting at noon today. And so I said, okay. So I rewrote that other grant into the CETA format and it got funded. And then, so I only stayed in it for 2 years. And then I got involved in another grant that I wrote. And so I had to give that up. And so I didn't follow all of the development and after that. And I really should go back and see what I could do to dig up but I know just from my short 2 year experience, it affected a lot of kids' lives. They saw themselves as differently because they were able to participate in their own education in kind of exciting ways. So,
Wow, that's really that's impressive.
well,
So then this was, so you were a professional grant writer. This is how you put
yeah,
food on the table.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and but this was before you went into being a professor.
right.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So, and then unfortunately, I wrote a gifted education grant and we had 3 years of secure funding. And at the end of those 3 years, I hadn't written 3 or 4 grants in order to get one, as you had to do in those days. And so I was up without a job. And that's why I got into teaching at the university.
Wow. Yeah, that was a period in history which was sort of similar to today in terms of its intensity, right?
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
And levels of polarization as well as uh, new innovation. You know.
And see that, what people don't understand, though, people worry about, they always talk about the leftward drift. And I would invite anybody to make a serious comparison between Richard Nixon and Bernie Sanders in terms of policies. And my bet is that Nixon would come out to be a little more liberal. On environmental education, Community Development Act, ESEA, all of
Really?
those programs, and a universal health care that wasn't liberal enough for Robert Kennedy and that crowd, but was probably more liberal than Obama's health care. And of course, then there's all the other crap about Nixon, which is a whole nother story. But just on social policies.
So you're seeing a devolution.
Yes, yeah.
Great thing to grow old with, huh? Like,
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it just bothers me because people think that um, that we've drifted to the left, and we have not drifted to the
no,
left at all.
no, starting with Reagan, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, well, that's more time than what time did we start? I got to check. We started at what time?
I didn't even check the time.
I think it was a little after 12, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
I
was
think
after
I
12:15.
better wrap this up, and I am sorry to the audience that we've drifted so far afield, but I think we've covered some interesting ground. Um,
Yeah,
and so
dude.
I will turn off the machine, and hopefully it will. Where is this? Recording, stop recording.